Okay, so this is I did not click share. Oh, present. This is discussing Browserker Authentication, kind of where we're at and where we're going. Just wanted to quickly highlight the current features that we have in place now, and then we can discuss the kind of future features that we're working on. This table basically highlights what we support now. The kind of interesting ones would be the unrestricted domain scope for authentication. And I'm calling this out because I don't know what DAST does right now in terms of if a user supplies a third-party domain like oauth.whatever.com and they're logging into example.com, does DAST allow that type of like external or third-party domain access? I implemented this by basically taking the scope service and making it unrestricted for during the login phase. So it'll just open up scope and allow any domain to go in. That could be very important, especially once we start looking more into various OAuth offerings. I'm still a little bit concerned about how OAuth is going to play out because it's very different between like Google's OAuth. You have like a very particular menu, and I'm wondering if it's going to actually end up being where we will need to build custom support for different types of OAuth services. But that's going to require some discovery phase, I think. But for now, at least they can put in a different URL.
Yeah. In terms of what DAST does, we've had.
Yep.
I know there's been one issue raised by a government customer where they struggle to log into their website because from what I could tell, the website wouldn't load the login page for our tool for whatever reason. So I went to their login page in a browser and it went through like 10 redirects and hit the login form. I went to it using DAST's tool and it returned something entirely different. It's like the login page knew we were a bot and rejected it, is the conclusion I came to. Interesting. But I mean, that was government, so presumably that was, I don't know. Yeah. Presumably that had extra security mechanisms.
Yeah, there's always going to be cases like that where we're just going to get just creamed for unknown reasons, or security is just going to get in the way of what we're trying to do.
But other than that, I would expect DAST to work if it could actually understand the page. Like I think it would load an external domain.
Okay, good to know.
I haven't checked it up. I'm pretty sure that's true.
Yeah, and this might be something we want to throw into an end-to-end test. So, multi-step authentication. This is also in DAST, but it's also now part of Browserker where we can have multiple, like supply username, click submit, supply password, hit login, and then it goes off and does its capturing of cookies information and then passing it off to Zap. The other stuff, pretty standard, custom headers, custom cookies. Yeah.
On that, just quickly, multi-step authentication. I noticed an end-to-end test for manual and auto. So so we can multi-step authenticate on when users have only supplied the username and password?
Correct. It tries to detect just login usernames only, and if it does, then it basically triggers it saying, okay, this is a multi-step authentication.
Right, so it figures out there's only one field in the form, basically.
Yep.
Yeah, cool.
Yep. Some upcoming features, allowing users to supply logged in detectors. So this is basically going to be a pretty simple function that the user supplies in a configuration file saying, okay, I want a verification URL. If they put that in, once the user, once the login authenticator goes to that, submits it, and then the next URL or the URL that it lands on, if it matches that verification URL, we consider them logged in. And we're also going to be building support for CSS selectors, so they can say verification CSS selector. So if after the login step occurs, if that CSS selector matches, then we can say, yes, they're logged in. Other ones are like text search, so they could just put in like hello or logged in username or whatever, try to match on that. That one's a little bit iffy because the user could very easily shoot themselves in the foot and just put in something that would match across all things. Other ideas. Yep.
So on that quickly, I'm working on the CSS selector. My plan was to build it in such a way that if they provide any of these configuration options, then it applies all of them.
Oh, so would it actually step through them?
Yeah, because otherwise we'd have to say, oh, you supplied the error, you supplied the verification URL and the CSS selector and then error. Like it should just do both, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree.
But
Yep.
Cool.
Yep. And in terms of if someone put an overly generic CSS selector that was found on the logged out page, will the system think that they're logged in, or we're going to know that they're logged out and say, hey, we found this, you gave us an incorrect value?
It would, I mean, it's not in there now, but my guess would be that we would just be confused. We would think that it's logged in when it really shouldn't be.
We would be confused. Or not, we wouldn't be confused. We would be sure that they're logged in.
Right.
We would be sure about our decision, which would be incorrect, but
correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. So if they give us a bad value, we're going to assume they're logged in.
Yep.
Okay.
Some other ideas, we could trigger on session IDs or storage tokens being set. This may or may not be worth the investment of engineering time, but basically we can do whatever we want to try to create these little detector systems. And then authentication reporting, which is what this demo is about, which I'm going to hop right into. Is there any questions on that or any other ideas or features that people have that they would like to see in? Nope. Okay.
Screenshots. Have we talked about screenshots? Or is that basically what your report is?
Yeah, that the authentication reporting will be the screenshot stuff.
Cool.
And just so everyone's on the same page here, this is very much in a draft mode. I just wanted to get something in there to demo to show like, hey, this is what I think would be very useful for customers. And then as a team, we can decide if there's more information that's needed, less information. And then also we need to obviously come to a consensus on what it should actually look like. So to give you an idea of that, I have two jobs. One is just a, let's see, yeah, two branches here. This is just a end-to-end test that I built for myself that runs in the pipeline. It's calling Browserker directly. It's not going through Dast. It has a configuration file. The first one is just doing DVWA, where we just have an admin and then the wrong password. So this is using the auto login. Oops, let me zoom in. Any questions so far?
I was just going to ask you to zoom in.
Zoom in, yep. So in this case, the auth report is being set in the configuration file. In the real world, it would be an environment variable. But once this job is kicked off, it would basically look like this. So Browserker would run the configuration. And this made me realize that we need to get rid of this database logging because it just clogs up the logs. But the end result is the last line, authentication failed, the login form was found after attempting to log in. So the way that the login detector works is it tries to log in, it notices the form, and then once it executes the login sequence, it looks for that same form again, says, hey, do I have a username and password field again? If so, then there's a very, very good chance that I've failed to log in. So the job fails. The customer,
which is a really clever way of identifying failed login, actually. I think that's really cool.
It is, but I'm still a little worried about it. But that's
I know it's not perfect, but
yeah.
I mean, I think probably 80% plus of websites are going to show you the same login form if you fail to log in.
Yep, totally agree.
Sorry, can you step back real quick? And I just want to
Sure.
see the configuration that you use for this.
Yeah. So this is actually, I can do it in web ID so I can show you that there's two. The GitLab CI, again, it's calling this branch directly, but this is basically, we just run past a configuration, and the customer would need to set like GL Dast auth report, and then this would be the configuration.
Hang on, the customer would be setting stuff in Dast. So it would be different to this, but yeah.
Yeah, yes, correct.
Right. So the TOML is the auth details is kind of what I was interested in.
Sure.
Yep. So it's username, password, and then the login URL, and then you try to do the rest.
Yep.
Or
and then if we
Browserker does the rest. Yep.
Yep. And then I'll show you a more complicated multi-step one in a second here. So this is it failing. If they supplied that GL Dast report, they would get this HTML file, which they click on, and since it's on a domain, it actually loads. Oh man, it's because I was doing screenshots earlier. And this is basically what they would see. So they'd say, okay, there's loading the login page. So each sequence that it takes, it tries to take a screenshot as well as capture the DOM. So you can see that it has, so if I were a customer and I didn't have, I didn't know what CSS selector to use or any other field, I could be like, okay, I need a, let's see, input class login name. So I would want to create a selector for name equals username. They would be able to add that to their field. And then it has the rest of the DOM there. They can close that down. Then they can look at the request and the response. So they say, okay, when it loads it, this is what the request looked like. Here's what the response looked like for that login page. And I noticed a lot of times when I was trying to get Dast working, I was getting completely different, or I didn't even know what the response would be. So now in this case, a user would be able to see an exact response of what the loaded page looked like. And then when it actually does the login submission, the DOM is going to be the same. You can see here it says login failed. So it's going to be very obvious for a user that, yeah, of course, the login failed. And then you can capture the actual post request as well as the response from that. So that's the simple auto version of it working. Any questions on this?
So a couple questions. So this is a single HTML file. So this file can get sent around and it's got all everything embedded in it. And then the second question I have is kind of Cam's example is if I give you, or if I plug in a URL and it's a redirect, which does a redirect, which does a redirect, and then I finally get a login form, will all of that get captured into this file? Or
not all the redirects. Our redirect handling is not great right now. What ends up happening because of the way that DevTools works is we would get the original request, so the GET request, we would pretty much not lose, but we wouldn't really capture any of the redirect. But what we would get is the final response, so that the initial GET request and the final load response, those would be the request response pair that they would see in this report.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So to your point about it all being included, yes. And unfortunately, I included all of Bootstrap, so it's like ridiculously long. We can obviously make this file smaller. I think for the very basic example, it's about 230 kilobytes of data for a single report. So
yeah, I like the fact that it's packaged up because it's really easy to send around. And
I didn't want any sort of third-party requests going out. So all the images are inlined using the data tag or data URL.
Yep.
And again, we can work on what it should actually look like for customers.
It could potentially have username and passwords in it, right?
Yeah, and I'm worried about the masking stuff. There's some functions within Browserker to mask credentials. We can do that. It would need to be after the fact because we need to match. So the way that it kind of determines what the request and response should be displayed is you'd supply the use, say, if it's a login username, match the request that contain the username. So we need that data just to match the request and response pair, but after that we can mask it. If that's what your concern was, I don't know if you had something else.
I was just curious.
Yeah. So if we look at a more complicated, this branch is a multi-step authentication using manual. This is going to login.live.com. It's putting in a username that is invalid. It has a CSS selector for the username field, a selector for the username submit field, password field, submit button. And again, the same auth report stuff. And the GitLab CI is exactly the same. It just spits out there. In that case, it goes through and this one just says login form found. This is the same issue it tried to identify. This time, instead of looking for the username and password field, it tries to use the selectors. So basically reruns the selectors and say, hey, did that selector match again? Yes, okay, then it probably didn't log in. And this report gets a little bit bigger because it's multiple step. But again, it's all self-contained. So we have the login page. Again, the DOM, in this case, since it's Microsoft, it's going to be ridiculously large. It's going to be harder, I think, for customers to know what the difference was, which makes me think we might want to do some sort of diffing and show like the difference of when it attempted to supply the username or password and then what the difference in the DOM was. but that's future stuff. So here we can see that says Microsoft account doesn't exist, enter a different user account. So that's going to fail. In this case, the request and response, oh, this one does send it. Right. So when you, in Microsoft's case, when you click the username submission, it actually submits a username. A lot of them don't. They'll just kind of store it in the DOM and then wait for the actual password submission. Then they send the request. So it's, again, it's totally up to the developer of the application of what it's going to look like. So the same, if exists result 1. So clearly this username doesn't exist. And then it tries to click on the next button after putting that invalid user, and it says troubleshooting details. So you can see there's this difference that would be, a user would be able to see like, oh, okay, so there's some sort of difference between the username submission and the password submission. And that's the result we get for that.
That login submit, is that actually a URL that you can click on that page? Because that would be a post, wouldn't it?
It's just a link to it. It's not going to actually post the data to it. We could
add just like making it a link on the form implies it's a get, but
yeah. So you're talking about these links right here, right?
Yeah. Like, is that the link that was actually posted, like that JSON script, that JSON username and password to?
Let's see the request response. Oh, this one's empty. Oh, this just takes the URL of the browser at the time. So in the reporting, there's this the sections field where you do an add section. You would put in, part of it is pulls out the end URL. So whatever URL the browser's on would be displayed there. And it's going to be different, obviously. Now, actually, I'll show you in the next one, which is our one of our unit tests, where in this case, after the login submission, you get a redirect. In this case, the last URL would be error invalid login. So this is the this is just one of an app that I built. I just ripped some login page, and what it does is it uses the same field and it just hides the email field and then shows the password field. And then it does a JSON submit in the background. In this case, there would be empty fields because it didn't actually submit anything. But once it does the login, it does submit this JSON request, and then it gets the response of error invalid login. So that's pretty much the idea behind these authentication reports. I think, again, just giving some sort of visual cues to a customer will really help them debug any issues that they have. So yeah. Going back to my slides.
So right now, does it report, you get that HTML report regardless of whether it's succeeds or fails?
Right now, yes. We kind of made the conscious decision, if they supply it, then we're just going to create it.
Okay.
As in, if they configure the report name, it will produce a report.
Yep. Which might be good because, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to suggest we change the name of the report. It says GitLab Authentication Report, which I wonder if is like some people are going to take as, oh, we've evaluated your authentication and this is what we think, as opposed to on this pipeline, this is what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just generic filler data that I could put in. Like, we might want to change this. This is all up for discussion. I'm not
cool.
coding any of this stuff.
This is really useful, by the way. Like, if I was running Dast or like running end-to-end tests on every single product I've formerly worked on, this would have been really useful.
So on, I think the first slide you had, you talked about some of the other fields that you support.
Yep, let's go back to that.
So we saw how your demo was the auto login detection. Is that correct?
Both. It was the manual login was the login.live, the Microsoft one.
Okay.
And then the auto login was the DVWA.
Got it. And so how do you configure custom cookies and headers?
That injects them directly into the browser. So that actually wouldn't, since there would be no real login page, it wouldn't really kick off the authentication service. In that case, it doesn't really treat the custom headers or cookies as being part of authentication. It just assumes that value should be set on every browser instance that's started up. So this auth report stuff wouldn't work.
So the auth details in that TOML that
Yep.
that information wouldn't get filled out because you'd have headers and
Right.
cookies that,
Yep.
and those headers and cookies aren't necessarily login. They can be whatever the heck you wanted.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So that's a different section of the configuration file.
Yep.
Gets set there. Yep.
Okay.
And yeah, again, templates up for discussion, but these are just for people who don't have access to the recording. They can look at, this is a single step and this is the multi-step.
And then I think I know the answer to this. CAPTCHA would block this.
Yes, absolutely. But they at
and
least
then-
know that there was a CAPTCHA blocking you.
Yep. And then two-factor authentication, there's no, I guess, infrastructure right now to handle that. So if, you know, you get past the username, password, and then usually that third screen is, hey, plug in your two-factor authentication. That would probably block them as well, and we just see the JPEGs.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and outside of having some sort of like outbound webhook, I don't see how they would be able to do this. Like they would need to be physically waiting at their somewhere waiting to put in the token value. But that's
Right.
Yeah. Also, mutual TLS authentication certificates is not in there. But I looked up how to do it. It doesn't look too hard, so I don't imagine it'll be a significant amount of work to get it to work. So.
Yeah, mutual TLS will be important for some customers,
Yes.
especially on the public sector side in the US. I know there's several requests I've gotten about mutual TLS. So
yeah, and I saw that ticket and I looked up how to do it with Chromium. It looks like you just set it for the Ubuntu image and then it should just pick it up. So
okay. And then also, I think that we should run the template and design by Annabelle and get her to try to come up with a design for that so that it looks good.
GitLab. Yep.
Yeah.
For the report?
Yeah, for the report.
Okay. So I actually was thinking differently. I was thinking that that's just a debug report. Like it's not worth too much work on there.
It's not, but there might be some easy things that she would have suggestions for. I think it's worth getting her to look over it and decide whether it's whether we need to do anything with it or not.
Okay.
Have you thought about how to integrate this into Dast?
The only requirement for Dast is that we would add it to the Browserker configuration thing, the Python file that translates the environment variables. So it'd be like a Dast _Browserker _auth report or whatever. Outside of that, since I've already replaced, we no longer use WebDriver for Browserker. Browserker just uses the auth details fields now. So we don't have to worry about the whole conflicting of Dast authentication with Browserker authentication. So
Yeah, I guess we'd also need to make sure that report is an artifact.
what do you mean need to make sure?
As in when the customer configures their template, they need to, if they want to be able to download that report, they need to make it an artifact in the CI job.
Right. Yeah, that's going to be confusing because they're going to like, I put in the environment variable. Why do I also need to do this? I don't know if there's a way we could automatically have it.
I don't know if we can like always include it in the Dast latest template, and then I don't know if the job will fail or not if it's not there, but it's probably something to test. But if we could just put it there and like it didn't fail the job, then I think we should do that.
Or at least give like, maybe not fail, but even if it gives like conflicting information, like failed to upload artifact, blah, blah, blah. It's like, why not? What is that if they didn't supply it? You know?
Yeah.
So yeah, something to think about.
So is this at a point where we could rip out what we're doing on the Dast for authentication and swap out this and put this engine in there?
So the way that it's built, we do have a, so the CLI option allows you to run just the authentication as well. So technically, yes, you would just call Browserker and then auth, and then you would pass in whatever translated configuration values we would need. So the plumbing is all there. It's just not wired up. But I would presume we would want to do that eventually, especially once the auth report stuff's in, because that would give customers a huge win for just normal Dast. So
I'm just trying to think if that would work, because the only authentication mechanism Zap supports is session cookies, or we could just have a custom header that is on every single request.
yeah, so I mean,
if there's anything that's related to session storage,
yeah, we're out of luck.
We're out of luck. So yeah, it's just something to be a bit careful of.
Right. So, I mean, if we break that down a bit, there's if a customer is using a target website now that does use session local storage or session storage in the browser, they're going to be out of luck no matter what, because authentication is just going to fail, or it'll look like it'll set a cookie,
True.
but then the crawler won't do anything. It's going to be the same if we use Browserker, where Browserker would be able to crawl it, but since we're using crawljacks, they would just get the cookies, and then again, same end result, the crawler would fail.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, and they would have no idea why. We'd say, well, why are you using crawljacks anyway? Use Browserker.
Yeah.
They turn Browserker on, they do a full scan. The passive part would work and the active part wouldn't. Is that right?
The passive part would work?
Yeah, because it would be run through Browserker.
Oh,
but the active scan would fail because Zap wouldn't be able to log in.
Well, no, because right. No, well, it depends. It depends on how they're using the we're assuming now that local storage or session storage has JWT tokens in it. That is completely dependent on the lifetime of those tokens. So what will happen is, as Browserker is crawling, it is going to be having this JWT token most likely in a header that's going outbound. For attacks that are reusing or replaying original requests, that header would still be there, but any new requests that are generated would not have it. And I think Craig had brought this up a while back when we were talking about the Dast URL path information. It wouldn't have those. It needs to generate new requests, so it wouldn't have session cookies. We have to inject it, which we do with the Zap API, HTTP sessions, like add cookies or whatever, but we wouldn't be able to do the storage stuff.
So either way, local, like session storage doesn't work right now for Dast, full stop, right?
Pretty much.
And if we turn Browserker on, then it will work it should work for a passive scan. Right?
Yes, yeah. Passive scan is, since the Zap is always listening for any of the requests that are going through the proxy, it's just going to scan those records. It'll work, no doubt.
Yeah.
But yeah, active ones, it's hit or miss. It really depends on how the JWT sessions are being used. Yeah.
So we probably could, but the hard thing about deciding to replace the Dast authentication mechanism with the Browserker one is we don't actually know if it's breaking or not.
Right. And it could very well break. Like maybe for some users, the Dast authentication is working just fine, and then we replace it with Browserker, and then Browserker thinks something differently because the logic is different. Or the other side of it is that customers thought their authentication was working this entire time and it really hasn't, and then Browserker saying, no, guess what, you haven't been logging in for the past 6 months. So there's those cases as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the safest thing to do is just replace the authentication when we remove Zap, but maybe that's too far off in the future.
Is switch when we switch to Dast 2 a good opportunity to do it?
Like 14.0 when we do the deprecation.
Yeah, when we do 14.0.
That's not my decision to make.
I mean, Dast is GA and Browserker is not, right?
Yeah, I think that might be pushing it. I wonder whether we just have an opt-in for that, or an environment variable that says use this new authentication mechanism, and if it does, the Python
I think
goes
that's
down.
safer.
Python uses Browserker. If not, it uses the existing system. And so we let people opt in, and then maybe at like midway through 14, we change the default if it's been working pretty nicely.
Yeah, that sounds safer to me. Something if we were a few releases into this of people using it and knew how stable it was or not, that would be one thing. But it being, basically the release after we're just starting to elicit feedback, I think that would be risky.
Yep.
I think delaying is sensible, although be aware that it creates another, I guess, use case of Dast in the sense that, which is more complicated for us, which is that you either use the Python or you use Browserker, and now we're saying you can use Python with a bit of Browserker. It's like, just use Browserker.
A lot of
people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's definitely not ideal, but until we can really guarantee or really minimize the chance of breaking someone's CI pipeline, that might be our only option.
Fair enough.
I think we should be able to test it fairly well against what's stock, because the authentication for Dast is pretty straightforward. It looks for, it's got auto login, and then it looks, or you can pass in 2 values. So we can check to make sure that same functionality is working in the Browserker. And I think that should cover most cases, unless someone's done something very strange.
I mean, the Dast, it is a bit strange in the sense that, I think by default, it excludes URLs with logout in the name. So, but Browserker doesn't. So do we have to reproduce that feature in Browserker to actually make that change as an example? I don't know. There's some questions to answer.
Yeah, there may be a couple sticky areas, but I guess what I'm saying is I think it's feasible to move people from Dast over to Browserker and minimize the amount of breakage.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. I guess that's it. Unless anybody has anything else?